Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Eirik and welcome to part 2 of Sculpting the Skull. So for this part there's a couple of format changes that I've done that I want to address right away. The last video was sped up 800% and I didn't cut anything, and I think it became a little bit too quick and it was kind of difficult to follow. So on this one we've slowed it down. It's 400% sped up, or 4 times sped up, and I've cut out a couple of the more boring bits. I've cut out every single time I walk back, and I've also cut out the times when I redraw the center line, which happens quite a lot, and you'll see that I try to keep that center line very clean, easy to see, because it works as my rudder, and everything that I add should be symmetrical to that center line, 90 degrees to that center line. So it's important to have it as clean and clear as possible. So for the most part in this episode, you're going to see me kind of do small changes and make small corrections essentially. And there's going to be a lot of work on the edges, as you're seeing right now. As I'm working up in that eyebrow, that eyebrow kind of has 2 sections to it. Towards the center around the nose, there's a softer turn, and then towards the outer edge there's a sharper turn. So I try to establish these sorts of things at this stage. The difference in edge quality essentially. Am I having sharp turns or longer, slower turns? But as you can see, everything is still very flexible. It is a lot of pieces of clay, and I haven't started really rendering things out a ton. I'm also going to move a little bit more into tools. You'll see me do a couple of tools and use a couple of tools in this video, and I will do a separate video on what type of tools I use. This one right here is a very nice rake tool that I like to use. You'll see me use some kind of wooden spatula tools, and yes, I will do a separate video talking about my tools, because it can get a little bit tedious. I don't know, some people are very excited about tools. I'm always very excited about tools. Some people couldn't care less so. Even though my profile is kind of established, I'm always going back to it, because things do get distorted as you work the front, and so I'm always coming back to that profile. There's always certain areas that end up getting left behind a little bit, or that doesn't work as well as they used to. So it's important to kind of constantly come back to that. And again, here you see me always walking back and forth. If you work too close to your subject for too long, you end up working on top of it, and all your observations will be from very close, where there's distortion in perspective and things like this. So it's important to constantly step back and work from a distance. It's kind of one of the basic, very, very basic elements that we try and teach people, is to step back. And it's always a bit of a challenge, honestly. I'm always kind of having to remind myself to do it. And when I run the camera, which as you can see here by the lighting situation, I clearly should have done a little bit of a better job doing. When I run the camera on my own while I sculpt, I constantly have to go and check the camera, and it kind of helps me remind me to step back a little bit. So having things like that is always a good thing. We always joke that it'd be nice to kind of have almost like a bungee cord attached to the wall, and then you had to fight to get up to your sculpture, and then you would get pulled back, and so in that way you wouldn't end up standing on top of your sculpture sculpting the whole time, which is an issue a lot of people have. Now it can seem like right here that I'm standing on top of my sculpture all the time, and again, that's just because I've cut out all the times when I'm not standing on top of it, because I don't know, you probably want to, if you're watching this, you probably want to see me put actual clay on the sculpture, not watch me stand, halfway across the room and just stare at a skull. Also, the video would be very long if we did that, so. And again, as I spoke about, I'm back to the profile, trying to get that accurate. There's always kind of subtleties that exist in, you know, any subject that you try and sculpt, and those subtleties can be very, very easy to miss in the beginning, and it very often takes some time observing your subject until you kind of see those things. And this is one of the things that I've been talking about a lot in school lately, is the idea that you try to progress something forward, but you do it in a way so that you're flexible to make changes, because usually you'll see mistakes that you've made once you kind of progress past the point where they can or should be fixed. Now, part of that is anticipation, which is practice. The more you practice, the easier and better you are going to get at anticipating those things. But you can set yourself well up by remaining flexible, or making sure that your sculpture remains flexible, so that, and you can progress in a flexible manner. Now, it's a little bit tricky to show with something like this, but once we start sculpting, once I start sculpting figures for you guys and things like that, it'll be a little bit more easy to see what I mean with that. But by progressing in a way that that's gonna be flexible for you, you can whenever you can progress, but then also be in a good place to step back and make the changes that needs to be made. Now, for example, if I were to render out this skull here and just rake it down and make it nice and smooth, I'd be less inclined to change things, for example, about the skull. And I think after this session, from a picture that I took, I realized that my skull is maybe a little round. It lacks a little bit of planar quality. But because I haven't, you know, rendered it out and made it all nice and smooth, and I'm not so married to this. I'm very aware that things will probably have to change, and that's okay. But at the same time, I had to progress to a certain point. I do end up cleaning up a little bit more than what it is right here to kind of realize that. So just something to keep in mind, you know, progress in a flexible manner, so that once you do progress and you'll be able to spot those mistakes because you have progressed, you can come back or you'll be willing to come back and fix them and not compromise. Now, sculpture is compromise, you know. You're never gonna, well, maybe somebody will, but definitely not me. I'm not gonna get a completely accurate representation of my subject, usually ever. And you know, you try, you get close, but there's always compromises that has to be made in order to make it what we call a functional sculpture. What I mean by that is a sculpture that functions onto itself. So, you know, it doesn't have in the case of a figure, it doesn't have a rib cage that's completely asymmetrical, for example, or, you know, the bones are not symmetrical, or they don't make sense, or in something like a skull, it doesn't have an inaccurate profile which has compromised the positioning of the other elements, for example, the eyebrows or the cheekbones or something like that. So there will always be compromises, but you want to try and, you know, minimize them as much as possible. But especially when you're sculpting something where the idea is to make a finished product, you know, a finished sculpture, which is my plan here, is to make a finished sculpture. And I assume for most people who sculpt, that is kind of what they want to do, is to make a finished sculpture. You're going to have to end up compromising a little bit, which is fine, usually. Okay, so this is an interesting part, actually. I'm starting to map in a new element, the teeth. And the way that I do that is I start out by drawing. So I draw in kind of the line of the teeth. And this is kind of how I start anything that's new. I want to draw it in on the clay, so I use like a little spatula, or it almost looks like kind of like an arrow-shaped tool, and I draw a line in for where I want the teeth, more or less, and then I reinforce my drawing with clay. I think a lot of people, it's important to draw on the clay, and if you draw on the clay, you can always change it, right? You're not committed to anything. If you put clay on there, you're a little bit more committed. But it is important to not only do drawing, you do drawing to see if it's going to work, and then you need to reinforce that drawing with some clay, otherwise you're never going to progress. And here I'm just using a very simple Kemper tool to kind of draw. And that's that wooden spatula again. So again, the teeth became, on this sculpture, kind of an area where I had to compromise a little bit, which is probably because I was poorly, maybe not poorly, but not as perfectly set up as I would have liked to from the beginning. So some of the angles of the teeth changed a little bit compared to the original skull. They're not as angled inwards. The teeth on the skull they're quite sharply angled inwards, especially those on the teeth on the side. I don't know. I'm not a dentist, so I don't know what you'd call those teeth, but. And some of this stuff, you know, in the back molars and things like that, it's too dark to really show you guys what's going on, so I decided to kind of skip ahead a little bit. Another important thing that I experienced when I sculpted the skull, when I studied at the Florence Academy myself a couple of years ago, is that the teeth, it's important to recognize that this is not a sculpture of teeth. And what that means is that if you look at the skull, the plaster skull, the teeth don't necessarily jump out at you that much. Now, why is that? It's because the shadow and the contrast between the teeth is not a super sharp line. It's not a very sharp, dark line. Now, it is a shadow, but you don't want there to be this deep gouge in between them. And perhaps that's what you would be inclined to do. Because you kind of want to show off, you know, the teeth, they're cool. You want to show off the placement of things. But this kind of goes for everything. Everything in the human body, and on the skull clearly, is a lot more subtle than you'd think. So to kind of deal with that, I end up running my tool across it and kind of smoothing out the transition between the teeth, making it a softer transition essentially. And I think for most people, almost always, a softer transition is a thing they need to work on. Most people have way too harsh transitions. I know I do. So unless I pay attention to that and kind of dial that back, and that's something that I always try to do, it can be easy where it becomes a sculpture that is about something that you don't want it to be about. The focal point shouldn't be the teeth. It should be the, you know, perhaps more the eye or the overall structure. It shouldn't be a sculpture. It's not a sculpture of teeth. It's a sculpture of a skull, right? So you want people to see the entire skull, not just teeth. And that goes for any figure or any sculpture for that matter. If you have any questions about anything or something didn't seem clear in the video, please feel free to comment and write your questions in the comment section, and I'll answer them as best as I can. Thank you for watching part 2 of sculpting the skull. In part 3 we'll progress even more, and hopefully by part 4 I think we'll probably be done. If you enjoyed the video, please hit like and hit the subscribe button as well if you want to see more. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.